Right now, wherever you are in the world, you probably know what time it is. You glanced at your phone or your watch or a clock on the wall, and you did not think twice about it. But here is something worth thinking about. The time on that clock was not decided by scientists. It was not decided by governments. It was not decided by any democratic process or international agreement. It was decided in large part by American railroad companies in the 1880s. Companies that were tired of trains running late and passengers missing connections, and then gradually imposed on the rest of the world over the following century, often over the fierce objections of the people who had to live by it. The global time system that every person on Earth now uses, the 24 time zones, the coordinated universal time, the way the entire planet synchronizes its clocks, is not a natural feature of the world. It is a commercial solution to a logistical problem, dressed up as a scientific fact. And some parts of the world are still fighting it. For almost all of human history, time was local. Every town set its clocks by the sun. When the sun was at its highest point in the sky, solar noon, the town's clocks read 12 o'clock. This made perfect intuitive sense. The sun was the universal timekeeper. Everyone could see it. Everyone could agree on it. The problem was that solar noon is different in every location. A town 20 miles to the east experiences solar noon about a minute and a half earlier than a town 20 miles to the west. This means that if you traveled from one town to the next, even a short distance, the time was slightly different when you arrived. For most of human history, this did not matter. People did not travel fast enough, or far enough, or often enough for small differences in local time to cause serious problems. If the clock in the next town was 3 minutes ahead, you adjusted. It was a minor inconvenience, not a crisis. Then came the railroads. The railroads moved people faster and farther than anything that had come before. And they moved on schedules, fixed departure and arrival times printed in timetables that passengers relied on to plan their journeys. The problem was immediately apparent. A train that departed from New York at 9 o'clock in the morning was arriving in cities whose clocks showed different times, not because the train was early or late, but because local time in those cities was genuinely different from local time in New York. By the mid-19th century, the United States had dozens of different local times in use simultaneously, often varying by just minutes from one town to the next. The situation became almost impossibly complicated. Each railroad company set its timetables according to its own reference city. The Pennsylvania Railroad ran on Philadelphia time. The Baltimore and Ohio ran on Baltimore time. The New York Central ran on New York time. A passenger trying to connect between two railroads at a junction city might find that the two companies disagreed about what time it currently was, by anywhere from a few minutes to half an hour. Railway stations in major cities sometimes had multiple clocks on the wall, one for each railroad company operating from that station, all showing slightly different times. Pittsburgh, at one point, had 6 different official times in use simultaneously. This was not just confusing, it was dangerous. Trains running on different time systems on the same tracks were a recipe for collision. The pressure to standardize was not philosophical, it was practical, economic, and urgent. The man most credited with solving the problem was not a government official or a scientist. He was a railway engineer and amateur astronomer named Sanford Fleming, a Canadian who had missed a train in Ireland in 1876 because of a misprint in the timetable, and who spent the following years obsessed with the idea of a rational global time system. Fleming proposed dividing the world into 24 time zones, each 1 hour apart, centered on lines of longitude spaced 15 degrees apart around the globe. Within each zone, all clocks would show the same time. The boundary between zones would be agreed in advance. The whole system would be anchored to a single prime meridian, a fixed reference line from which all other times would be calculated. It was an elegant idea, but it required someone to actually implement it. On November 18, 1883, a day that became known as the Day of Two Noons, the major North American railroad companies simultaneously reset their clocks to 4 standard time zones covering the continent. At noon in each zone, telegraph signals went out across the railroad network, and station clocks were adjusted to the new standard time. In cities east of the new zone boundary, clocks were turned back. In cities west of it, they were turned forward. The reaction was not universally positive. Many people were outraged. Local newspapers called it an attack on natural time, an arrogant imposition by commercial interests on communities that had been setting their clocks by the sun for generations. Some cities refused to adopt railroad time and maintained their own local time for years afterward. The mayor of Bangor, Maine, declared that his city would keep its own time regardless of what the railroads decided. But the logic of the system was irresistible. Travel, trade, and communication increasingly required a common time reference. The railroads had the practical power to enforce their standard on anyone who wanted to use their network, which, by the 1880s, was almost everyone. The United States government did not officially adopt standard time zones until 1918, 35 years after the railroads had already imposed them. The law merely formalized what the railroads had already made inevitable. Internationally, the process was slower and more contentious. An international conference held in Washington in 1884 agreed on the prime meridian, the line of zero longitude from which all time zones would be measured, and placed it through Greenwich, England, a choice that was politically charged since it effectively made British imperial infrastructure the reference point for all of global time. France refused to adopt Greenwich Mean Time for another 27 years, insisting on using Paris Mean Time instead. Over the following decades, country after country adopted the standard zone system, usually when the pressure of international trade and communication made the alternative too costly. By the mid-20th century, the system was effectively global, but not everyone surrendered. China, a country that spans what should be 5 time zones by geographic logic, uses a single national time, set to Beijing time, for the entire country. In the far western province of Xinjiang, this means the sun does not rise until 10 in the morning in winter. Local communities there have long maintained their own unofficial time, 2 hours behind Beijing, simply to align their daily lives with the actual movement of the sun. India uses a single time zone offset by 30 minutes from its neighbors, a compromise designed to avoid the country being split into 2 zones. Nepal, unwilling to simply adopt India's time, chose an offset of 5 hours and 45 minutes from Greenwich, one of only a handful of countries in the world that uses a 45-minute offset. North Korea in 2015 created its own time zone, set 30 minutes behind South Korea and Japan, as an explicit act of political defiance, specifically rejecting the time zone that Japan had imposed during its colonial occupation of the peninsula. 3 years later, as part of diplomatic negotiations with South Korea, it switched back. The global time system looks from the outside like a rational scientific arrangement. It is taught in schools as a geographic fact. The world divided into zones, each 1 hour apart, all synchronized to a universal reference. But underneath that appearance of rationality is a history of commercial pressure, political imposition, and colonial legacy. The prime meridian runs through Greenwich, not because Greenwich is the center of the world, but because Britain was the dominant naval power in 1884, and its hydrographic charts were the ones most widely used by ships at sea. The 24-zone system was adopted not because a global scientific committee determined it was optimal, but because American railroad companies needed their trains to run on time. And the people who objected, the mayor of Bangor who refused to reset his clocks, the residents of Xinjiang who maintained their own informal time, the North Korean government that briefly created a new time zone out of historical grievance, were not being irrational. They were asserting something real. That time, as experienced by human beings, belongs to the place where the sun rises and sets, not to a commercial network's operational requirements. The next time you glance at your phone and see the time, you are looking at the residue of a decision made by American railroad executives in 1883, formalized by a conference that handed Britain's prime meridian to the world, resisted and resented and partially rejected by communities on every continent, and now so deeply embedded in daily life that it feels like physics. It is not physics, it is history. Someone decided it, someone benefited from it, and somewhere in Western China, someone is still quietly ignoring it, which raises a question worth sitting with. How many of the other invisible systems that structure your daily life were decided the same way, by someone, for reasons that had nothing to do with you, and have simply been there long enough that they feel like facts? If you have ever driven abroad and found yourself on the wrong side of the road, you know the particular terror of that moment, the flash of oncoming headlights, the instinctive swerve, the realization that everything you know about driving is suddenly reversed. About 65% of the world's countries drive on the right side of the road. The remaining 35% drive on the left. These two groups are not distributed randomly. They cluster in ways that reveal something specific about the history of power, empire, and the decisions of a handful of individuals who never had to live with the consequences. The side of the road you drive on was not chosen by traffic engineers or safety researchers. It was not the result of any logical analysis of which side is better. It was decided by feudal custom, by Napoleon Bonaparte, by the British Empire, and by the particular way that one Swedish king chose to humiliate his own people on a single autumn morning in 1967. Before there were cars, there were roads, and before there were traffic rules, there were customs. In medieval Europe, the default was to travel on the left side of the road. The reason was practical and martial. Most people are right-handed. A right-handed traveler on horseback kept to the left, so that their sword arm, their right arm, was free to face any oncoming stranger or threat. Passing someone on your left meant your weapon hand was between you and them. It was a defensive posture built into the geometry of travel. This left-side custom was widespread enough that in 1300, Pope Boniface VIII formally instructed pilgrims traveling to Rome to keep to the left. It is one of the earliest recorded traffic rules in history. For centuries, the left-side default held across most of Europe. Then came two forces that changed everything: Napoleon Bonaparte and the horse-drawn freight wagon. The freight wagon changed the equation in an unexpected way. Large freight wagons, pulled by teams of horses, were driven not from an elevated seat at the front, but from the back of the left, most horse in the team, the position that gave the driver the best control of the animals with a whip held in the right hand. A driver sitting on the left rear horse, holding a whip in his right hand, naturally wanted to pass oncoming wagons on their left, so he could see the clearance between the wheels on his right side. Passing on the left meant traveling on the right side of the road. This practical shift was already underway in parts of France and the American colonies in the late 18th century. But it was Napoleon who turned a regional habit into a continental system. Napoleon was left-handed. He had always attacked from the right. Charging to the right side of the road meant his sword arm faced the enemy. When he marched his armies across Europe, they marched on the right. And as his empire expanded to cover most of the continent, the right-hand rule followed. Prussia, Poland, Spain, the territories of the Holy Roman Empire. Wherever Napoleon's armies went, right-hand traffic followed. The countries that resisted Napoleon, Britain, Portugal, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, largely kept their left-hand custom. And when the British Empire spread across the world, it carried left-hand traffic with it. India, Australia, South Africa, Hong Kong, Kenya, left side. France, Germany, Italy, the United States, right side. The global split we live with today is, to a remarkable degree, a map of Napoleonic conquest and British imperial reach. The United States is an interesting exception that proves the rule. The American colonies were British, which meant they inherited left-side driving. But after independence, the new republic wanted to distinguish itself from Britain in every possible way, including, apparently, which side of the road to drive on. The freight wagon culture was already pushing toward right-side driving, and the post-independence mood made the switch easy. By the early 19th century, the United States had settled firmly on the right. When American automobile culture spread across the world in the 20th century, along with American roads, American cars with left-hand steering wheels designed for right-side driving, and American road-building infrastructure, it reinforced the right-side majority even further. By the mid-20th century, the global picture had largely stabilized. Most of continental Europe drove on the right. Most of the British Empire's former territories drove on the left. But there were awkward anomalies. Sweden, despite being a neutral country that had never been conquered by Napoleon, had maintained left-side driving. This was increasingly strange in a country whose roads connected directly to right-side driving Norway, Denmark, and Finland. Swedish cars had their steering wheels on the left, designed for right-side traffic. But the Swedes drove on the left. Head-on collisions near border crossings were a serious problem. The Swedish government debated a switch for decades. Public opinion was strongly against it. In a referendum held in 1955, 83% of Swedes voted to keep driving on the left. The government switched anyway. On September 3, 1967, a date the Swedes called Dagen H, standing for Dagen Högertrafik, the day of right-hand traffic. Every vehicle in Sweden came to a stop at 4:50 in the morning. For the next 10 minutes, the entire country sat still. Then, simultaneously, every driver moved to the right side of the road and continued. The result was not chaos. Traffic was so light in those first hours, everyone had been warned to stay home, that the day passed remarkably smoothly. The accident rate in the weeks after the switch actually dropped because everyone was driving with extreme caution. Sweden's Dagen H is now studied in traffic engineering and public policy courses as one of the most successful mass behavioral changes in modern history. Sweden was not the last country to switch. In 1978, Iceland moved from left to right. In 2009, Samoa switched from right to left, making it one of the very few countries to have ever moved in that direction, primarily to align with Australia and New Zealand, its main trading partners, and to make it easier for the Samoan diaspora working in those countries to send home second-hand right-hand drive cars. Today, the countries that still drive on the left are mostly former British territories: the United Kingdom, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, India, Japan, South Africa, Kenya, and a handful of others. Japan is an interesting case. It was never part of the British Empire, but British engineers built Japan's first railways in the 1870s and established left-side conventions that persist today. The side of the road you drive on feels like a neutral technical standard. It is not. It is the residue of medieval sword-fighting customs, Napoleonic military logistics, British imperial expansion, the preferences of freight wagon drivers in 18th century France, and the particular politics of post-independence America. Countries that were never conquered by Napoleon drive on the left. Countries that were part of the British Empire mostly drive on the left too, unless they had strong reasons to align with a right-driving neighbor. The rule you follow every time you get in a car was set by forces that had nothing to do with road safety, traffic flow, or any rational analysis of which side is better. There is no evidence that driving on one side is safer than the other. The split is entirely historical. The next time you sit in the driver's seat, you are inheriting a decision made centuries ago by someone on horseback with a sword, refined by Napoleon's left-handedness, spread by British colonial administrators, and locked in place by the inertia of a world that found it easier to keep the existing system than to coordinate a change. Somewhere a Swedish traffic engineer is still proud that Dagen H worked, and somewhere a Samoan family is shipping a right-hand drive car across the Pacific to relatives in Auckland. Because in 2009, a government decided that the convenience of the present mattered more than the habit of the past. Which raises a familiar question. The systems we live inside always feel like facts. They feel neutral, inevitable, rational. But almost none of them are. They are the accumulated decisions of people who are long dead, made for reasons that made sense at the time, and inherited by everyone who came after without ever being asked. The road is just the most obvious example. At some point today, you will probably shake someone's hand, or you will see someone else do it. A greeting, a farewell, a deal being closed, an introduction being made. The gesture is so automatic that you perform it without thinking. Two people extend their right hands, grip, shake twice, release. It takes about 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, you are performing a ritual that is at least 2,500 years old, that began not as a greeting, but as a proof of something. That was adopted by merchants because it solved a specific legal problem that was spread across the world, partly by the religious convictions of a pacifist sect from 17th century England, and that is now so universal it appears in the founding documents of international law. The handshake is not a natural human behavior. No other species does it. Young children do not do it instinctively. They have to be taught. It is a technology invented for a purpose, refined over centuries, and so successfully deployed that it now feels like instinct. So what was it actually for? The oldest images of handshaking we have found come from ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Greece. Stone carvings and painted pottery showing two figures grasping each other's right hands. In these images, the handshake is not a casual greeting. It is a formal moment, the sealing of a treaty, the transfer of power, a covenant between rulers. The gesture had a specific logic. By extending your right hand, your sword hand, your weapon hand, and allowing another person to grip it, you were demonstrating two things simultaneously. First, that you were not holding a weapon. Second, that the other person now had hold of your weapon hand, making it momentarily impossible for you to draw one. The handshake was, at its origin, a mutual display of peaceful intent enforced by the mechanics of the gesture itself. You could not shake hands and reach for a sword at the same time. This is why the right hand, specifically. In a world where almost everyone is right-handed, the right hand is the threat hand. A greeting that immobilizes the threat hand is a greeting that provides a moment of genuine physical security. The ancient handshake survived into the medieval period, but it evolved. The up and down pumping motion that we now consider standard, rather than simply gripping and holding, may have developed partly as a way of dislodging any weapon that might be concealed up a sleeve. If you grip someone's hand and shake it vigorously, anything hidden in their sleeve tends to fall out. The gesture became not just a symbol of peaceful intent, but a practical check, a quick search disguised as a greeting. Whether this origin story is literally true or a later embellishment, it captures something real about the function of the handshake in an era when personal security was a constant concern and trust between strangers was genuinely difficult to establish. For most of European history, greetings between people were not equal. How you greeted someone depended entirely on the relative social status of the two parties. You bowed or curtsied to superiors. You expected bows and curtsies from inferiors. You might embrace an equal. The gestures were elaborate, differentiated, and deeply political, a physical map of the social hierarchy performed in the moment of meeting. The handshake, by contrast, was relatively flat. It was the same gesture regardless of who was doing it. This is why it appealed to the Quakers, the religious society of Friends, a Protestant sect that emerged in 17th century England and became one of the most influential forces in the history of the handshake. The Quakers believed in the fundamental equality of all people before God. They refused to bow, to remove their hats, or to use formal titles, practices they considered expressions of a social hierarchy they rejected. They refused to call anyone sir or my lord. They used thee and thou, the familiar forms of address, with everyone regardless of rank. And they shook hands with everyone equally, as a physical expression of the belief that no person was more deserving of deference than any other. The Quakers were a tiny minority, but they were disproportionately influential in commerce. Quaker merchants developed a reputation for honesty and fair dealing, partly because their religious commitments made deception a matter of conscience, not just reputation. They became trusted partners in trade networks across Britain and the American colonies. And wherever they traded, they shook hands. The handshake, partly through the Quaker network, became associated with honest dealing, with equality of parties, with the kind of trust that made commerce possible between strangers. As trade expanded in the 17th and 18th centuries, merchants faced a persistent problem. How do you make an agreement binding when you have no written contract, no witnesses, no legal mechanism? The handshake became one answer. In the trading culture of early modern Europe, a handshake between merchants was understood to be a binding commitment, not legally enforceable in the same way as a signed document, but socially and reputationally binding in a way that mattered enormously in communities where reputation was the primary collateral for future business. To shake on a deal and then break it was not just a legal matter. It was a profound social violation that could destroy a merchant's ability to do business in an entire network. The handshake was a public declaration, witnessed by whoever was present, that you were staking your reputation on your word. This gave the handshake something that written contracts of the era often lacked: immediacy, publicity, and social enforceability. You could dispute the meaning of a written clause. It was much harder to dispute that you had shaken on something in front of witnesses. By the 19th century, the handshake had migrated from commerce to politics to diplomacy to everyday social life. It appeared in descriptions of political negotiations, in accounts of business dealings, in advice manuals on polite behavior. The particular form it took, right hand, firm grip, 2 or 3 shakes, direct eye contact, became codified as a norm. Books were written about how to shake hands properly. A limp handshake became a social liability. A firm one became a signal of confidence and trustworthiness. The handshake also became embedded in international diplomacy. The image of 2 heads of state shaking hands across a table before cameras at the conclusion of negotiations became one of the most powerful visual symbols in modern politics. It did not merely signal agreement. It performed agreement publicly in a way that committed both parties in front of witnesses. When Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat shook hands on the White House lawn in 1993, the gesture did work that no document could quite do. It made visible in a single moment something that millions of people around the world could see and understand without any translation. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic briefly ended the handshake. For a period of roughly 2 years, the gesture that had survived 2,500 years of human history, wars, plagues, revolutions, the rise and fall of empires, was suspended by public health guidance. People bumped elbows, touched fists, nodded, waved, and something interesting happened. Many people did not miss it. The handshake, it turned out, had not been universal because it was the best possible greeting. It had become universal through history, commerce, and social convention, and it was entirely possible to greet someone without it. Some predicted the handshake would not return. It did return, more or less completely, more quickly than many expected. The social pull of a 2,500-year-old gesture turned out to be stronger than 2 years of public health guidance. But the pause revealed something. The handshake is not instinct. It is not biology. It is a learned behavior, a cultural technology, adopted because it solves specific problems, proving peaceful intent, sealing agreements, expressing equality, and retained because it continued to solve those problems well enough that the cost of changing felt higher than the cost of keeping it. The next time you extend your right hand to a stranger, you are performing a gesture that originated as a proof that you were not holding a sword. You are doing what Quaker merchants did in 17th century England to signal that they would deal honestly with you. You are doing what ancient Mesopotamian rulers did to seal covenants that would outlast them both. The gesture takes 3 seconds. It carries 2,500 years of accumulated meaning, most of which neither you nor the person you are greeting is consciously aware of, which is perhaps the most interesting thing about the invisible systems we have been examining in this series. They do not need to be understood to function. They only need to be performed. The meaning accumulates in the repetition, not in the explanation. You shake hands, you drive on a particular side of the road, you set your clock to a time decided by railroad companies 140 years ago, and none of it requires you to know why. Right now, if you are reading this, on a keyboard, look down at your fingers. The layout you are using, Q, W, E, R, T, Y, across the top row, was designed in the 1870s. Not for computers, not for efficiency, not because anyone determined it was the best possible arrangement of letters for human hands. It was designed to solve a mechanical problem that no longer exists, in a machine that no longer exists, for a technology that was replaced more than a century ago. And yet here we are. The QWERTY keyboard layout is used by hundreds of millions of people every day, on devices that the people who designed it could not have imagined, doing tasks that bear no relationship to the original problem it was meant to solve. It is one of the most successful design decisions in history, not because it was good, but because it arrived at exactly the right moment and proved almost impossible to dislodge once it had taken hold. To understand QWERTY, you have to understand the mechanical typewriter, specifically what went wrong with the early ones. The first practical typewriter was developed in the late 1860s by a newspaper editor and printer named Christopher Latham Sholes, working in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Sholes and his collaborators spent years refining the design, and in 1873 they sold the rights to the Remington Arms Company, a manufacturer better known for making guns, which had been looking for peacetime products after the Civil War. The early typewriters had a fundamental mechanical problem. When you pressed a key, a metal arm, called a type bar, swung up and struck an ink ribbon against the paper. If you typed quickly, 2 type bars could swing up at the same time and physically jam against each other. The more adjacent letters were placed next to each other on the keyboard, the more likely that common letter combinations would cause adjacent type bars to collide. This was not a small problem. Type bar jams were frequent, frustrating, and time-consuming to untangle. They slowed typists down more than any keyboard layout could. Solving the jam problem was the single most important design challenge facing early typewriter manufacturers. Sholes and his collaborators developed a layout that addressed the jam problem by separating commonly used letter pairs. If 2 letters frequently appeared together in English, like T and H or S and T, they were placed on type bars that were physically far apart from each other, reducing the chance that typing them in quick succession would cause a collision. The result was QWERTY. It was not designed for speed or comfort. It was designed to prevent mechanical failure in a machine built in 1873. The placement of each key was determined not by any study of human ergonomics or typing efficiency, but by the internal mechanical geometry of a specific typewriter's type bar arrangement. Some popular accounts claim that QWERTY was specifically designed to slow typists down, to give the type bars time to return before the next one struck. This is a slight oversimplification. The goal was to prevent jams, not to impose a speed limit, but the effect was similar. The layout that emerged was one that, by modern ergonomic standards, is significantly less efficient than alternatives that would be developed later. Remington began selling typewriters with the QWERTY layout in 1873. Within a decade, it had become the dominant standard in American offices. And once a standard dominates, it creates its own momentum, a phenomenon economists call a network effect. The logic of the network effect is simple and powerful. If most typewriters use QWERTY, then most typing instructors teach QWERTY. If most typing instructors teach QWERTY, then most trained typists know QWERTY. If most trained typists know QWERTY, then employers demand a QWERTY typist. If employers demand QWERTY typists, then typewriter manufacturers build QWERTY typewriters. The circle locks itself. By the 1890s, the first typing speed competitions were being held, and the winners, trained on QWERTY, were producing impressive speeds. This created another reinforcing loop. QWERTY was associated with expert performance, which made it seem validated, which encouraged more people to learn it. The mechanical problem QWERTY had been designed to solve was already becoming less severe as typewriter technology improved. But the layout itself had long since stopped being about the mechanical problem. It had become a standard, and standards have a life of their own. In 1936, a man named August Dvorak, a professor at the University of Washington, patented an alternative keyboard layout that he claimed was significantly more efficient than QWERTY. The Dvorak simplified keyboard placed the most common letters in English, A, O, E, U, I, D, H, T, N, S, on the home row, the row where your fingers naturally rest. This meant that trained Dvorak typists could type a much higher percentage of common English words without moving their fingers off the home row at all. Dvorak claimed this reduced finger movement, reduced fatigue, increased speed, and reduced the rate of repetitive strain injuries. Studies comparing QWERTY and Dvorak have produced results that remain genuinely contested. Some studies showed significant Dvorak advantages. Others, including a famous analysis by economists Leibowitz and Margolis in the 1990s, argued the advantages were overstated or unproven. What is not contested is that the Dvorak layout was never widely adopted, despite decades of advocacy. The reason is precisely the network effect that had locked QWERTY in place. By 1936, hundreds of thousands of typists were trained on QWERTY. Every typing school, every office, every typewriter was built around it. The potential efficiency gain from switching to Dvorak, even if real, was not enough to overcome the enormous coordination cost of switching an entire ecosystem of trained humans and manufactured machines simultaneously. When computers began replacing typewriters in offices from the 1970s onward, the mechanical problem that had created QWERTY ceased to exist entirely. There were no type bars. There were no jams. The entire original justification for QWERTY's design had evaporated. This was, in theory, the moment when the keyboard layout question could have been reopened. Computers were new, software was flexible, the input method was not yet fixed. If there was ever a moment to correct the mistake, this was it. It did not happen. The people moving from typewriters to computers already knew QWERTY. Computer manufacturers built QWERTY keyboards because their customers expected QWERTY. Software was designed around QWERTY shortcuts, Control-Z for undo, Control-C for copy, Control-V for paste, whose physical placement on QWERTY keyboards was partly deliberate and partly conventional. Changing the layout would have disrupted not just muscle memory, but an entire software ecosystem. The network effect held. QWERTY crossed from the typewriter age to the computer age completely intact, carrying with it a design rationale that had ceased to be relevant somewhere around 1950. Today, QWERTY is the default keyboard layout on virtually every computer, laptop, tablet, and smartphone in the English-speaking world. It is taught in schools. It is the assumed input method for almost all software. Billions of people have invested thousands of hours learning it. Dvorak remains available. It can be activated in the settings of most operating systems with a few clicks. A small community of enthusiasts use it. Typing speed records have occasionally been set on Dvorak, but it never broke through, and at this point, it probably never will. The window for a coordinated switch has most likely closed. Other alternative layouts have been developed, Colmach, Workman, and others, each claiming ergonomic advantages over QWERTY. They have even smaller user bases. The QWERTY story is sometimes presented as a cautionary tale about bad design persisting through inertia. That framing is not quite right. The original QWERTY design was not bad. It was appropriate for the problem it was solving. The problem was that the design became standard before anyone had the chance to evaluate whether it was optimal for any other purpose. What the QWERTY story actually reveals is something more unsettling. It reveals that in systems involving large numbers of coordinated human behaviors, the first solution to achieve critical mass tends to become permanent. Not because it is the best solution, but because the cost of coordinating a switch to something better exceeds the benefit of the improvement. There is no conspiracy here. No one designed QWERTY to be a permanent standard. No one decided it should persist into the age of computers. It persisted because of a simple, powerful, and largely invisible force. Once enough people have committed to a way of doing something, the accumulated investment of everyone who learned it becomes the primary obstacle to doing it differently. Every time you type the word "the," one of the most common words in English, your left hand moves from T to H while your right hand stays on E. T and H, two of the most frequently adjacent letters in English, are on opposite sides of the keyboard. That arrangement was chosen in the 1870s to prevent two metal arms from hitting each other inside a machine that no longer exists. The machine is gone. The problem is gone. The solution to the problem is still on your desk, which raises the same question this series keeps returning to. The systems we operate inside feel inevitable. They feel like the natural result of some rational process of getting things right. But very often, they are the fossilized solutions to problems that stopped existing long ago, held in place not by logic, but by the sheer weight of everyone who learned the old way and never had a reason to change. The keyboard is just the most visible example. Look for the others. At some point in the next few hours, you will probably stop at a red light. You will not think about it. The light will turn red and your foot will move to the brake. The connection between that color and that action is so deeply embedded that it feels biological, as though human beings are simply wired to stop when they see red. They are not. The association between red and stop is not instinct. It is not even particularly ancient. It is a specific historical decision, made for reasons that had nothing to do with roads or cars or human perception, by an industry that existed decades before the automobile was invented. The traffic light system that governs the movement of billions of vehicles every day across almost every country on Earth was not designed by traffic engineers. It was not the product of any study of human color perception. It was inherited, almost by accident, from the railway signal systems of 19th century Britain. And the reason red means stop has more to do with the navigation lights of ships at sea than with anything a road planner ever decided. Before there were traffic lights, there were railway signals. And before there were railway signals, there was chaos. In the early decades of the railway age, the 1830s and 1840s, trains had no reliable way to communicate with each other or with station operators about their position, speed, or intentions. Collisions were frequent and catastrophic. The pressure to develop a reliable signaling system was urgent. Railway companies experimented with various systems. One early approach used human flagmen stationed along the tracks who would wave flags to signal whether the line ahead was clear. Red flags signaled danger or stop. Green flags signaled caution. White or clear flags, or simply no flags, signaled all clear. The choice of red for danger was not arbitrary. Red had long been associated with warning and prohibition across many human cultures. In nature, many toxic or dangerous animals and plants display red coloring, and human beings may have a mild, evolved tendency to pay attention to red stimuli. But more practically, red dye was among the most available and stable of colors in the 19th century, making red flags easy to produce consistently. By the 1840s, British railway companies had largely standardized on a three-color system: red for stop, green for caution, and white for proceed. This system worked until it did not. The white signal for proceed created a dangerous problem that took decades and numerous accidents to fully appreciate. White, as a signal color, is extraordinarily easy to confuse with other light sources. A white signal light could be mistaken for a star, for a lantern carried by a pedestrian, for a light from a nearby building, or simply for the moon. In conditions of rain, fog, or mist, common in Britain, the confusion was worse. In 1876, a significant railway accident was attributed in part to a locomotive engineer who had mistaken a white light from a building for a proceed signal and driven into an occupied section of track. The inquiry that followed accelerated the movement to replace white as a proceed signal with something less ambiguous. The replacement was green, and this created an immediate secondary problem. Green had been the caution signal. Moving green to proceed meant caution needed a new color. The choice that emerged over the following decades was yellow, a color visible at long distances and not easily confused with red or the new green. By the end of the 19th century, the railway signal system had arrived at red for stop, yellow for caution, and green for proceed, not through any deliberate design process, but through a series of incremental adjustments driven by accidents and their subsequent inquiries. But the story of red's specific meaning goes back even further than the railways, to the navigation lights used by ships at sea. Maritime navigation had for centuries used colored lights to help sailors understand the position and movement of other vessels at night. By International Maritime Convention, a ship's port side, its left side, was required to display a red light, and its starboard side, its right side, a green light. An observer could tell which direction a ship was moving and which side was facing them by the colors they saw. Red on the port side was the side of potential collision when two ships were approaching each other head-on. Both would show their red lights. The Maritime Convention already associated red with danger and the need for caution before railways existed. When British railway engineers developed their first signaling systems, they drew on what was already familiar, the conventions of maritime navigation, which red already meant warning. The transfer of meaning from sea to land happened not through deliberate decision, but through cultural familiarity. By the time the automobile arrived at the end of the 19th century, the red, yellow, green railway signal system was already well established in Britain and spreading internationally. But the early automobile created new problems that neither the railway nor maritime systems had anticipated. Cars moved through cities, not along fixed tracks. They interacted with pedestrians, with horse-drawn vehicles, and eventually with each other, in all directions simultaneously. The railway signal system had been designed for trains traveling on predetermined routes. It did not immediately translate to the complex, multi-directional flows of city traffic. The first traffic signal specifically designed for roads appeared in London in 1868, predating the automobile entirely. It was a manually operated gas-lit signal outside the Houses of Parliament, designed to control the flow of horse-drawn carriages. It used the railway convention, red for stop, green for proceed. It exploded within a few weeks due to a gas leak, injuring the police officer operating it, and was not replaced for several decades. The first electric traffic light appeared in Cleveland, Ohio in 1914, again using red and green, by then well established as the universal signal convention inherited from railways. Yellow was added to give drivers warning of an impending change, imported directly from the railway caution signal. By the 1920s, the red, yellow, green three-color system was spreading rapidly across American and European cities. For the first few decades of the automobile age, traffic signal systems varied considerably between cities and countries. Different cities used different arrangements. Some placed red at the top, some at the bottom. Some used two colors, some three. Some had additional signals for specific maneuvers. The push for international standardization came through a series of international conventions on road traffic in the 1920s and 1930s. The 1931 Geneva Convention on Road Traffic established international standards that included the red, yellow, green color system. Over the following decades, as international automobile travel and trade increased, the pressure to standardize grew stronger. By the late 20th century, the three-color system was effectively universal, observed in virtually every country on Earth. Today, there are a small number of exceptions. Japan uses a blue-green light for proceed rather than pure green. The Japanese language has historically used a single word for both blue and green in certain contexts, and the traffic light color was influenced by this linguistic tradition, though it has gradually shifted towards standard green. Some countries use flashing signals or additional colors for specific purposes. But the fundamental logic, red stop, yellow caution, green go, is one of the most successfully standardized conventions in human history. The answer to the question, who decided red means stop, turns out to be nobody decided. Not exactly. Red accumulated its association with danger and stopping through a series of overlapping systems. Maritime navigation, railway signaling, early road signals, each borrowing conventions from what came before and adding incremental modifications driven by accidents, practical problems, and the particular constraints of each new technology. The color that seemed most dangerous, most attention-grabbing, most unmistakably a warning, red, was the natural anchor. But the specific system of red, yellow, green that now governs road traffic in almost every country is not the result of any scientific study of human color perception applied to road safety. It is the result of ship navigation conventions migrating to railways, railway conventions migrating to roads, and the whole system then being locked in place by international treaties before anyone thought to ask whether there might be a better way. The next time you stop at a red light, you are participating in a convention that began on ships at sea, was formalized by British railway engineers dealing with a fog problem, was adapted for automobiles that nobody had yet invented, and was turned into international law by diplomats in Geneva in 1931. Nobody sat down and decided that red should mean stop. Red meant danger in maritime navigation. Railway engineers used what they knew. Road engineers used what existed. International bodies standardized what had already spread. The result is a system so universal that it now feels like physics, as though red stopping things is a law of nature, rather than the accumulated residue of one industry borrowing conventions from another, across more than a century and a half of incremental change, which is perhaps the most important thing this series has been trying to say. The systems that feel most inevitable, the ones so embedded in daily life that questioning them seems almost absurd, are often the ones with the least rational origin. They are the ones that arrived early, spread fast, and were never seriously reconsidered because everyone was already using them. Red does not mean stop because red means stop. Red means stop because a British railway engineer in the 1840s needed a color that was easy to see and not likely to be confused with anything else, and reached for the same choice that ship navigators had been making for a century before him.